All right, good morning. Welcome back into Wake Up America. A lot happening over the weekend domestically, domestic politics as well. So right now we are 10 weeks away from the Iowa caucuses and just about a week away from the third GOP debate, which is going to happen down in Miami. Former Vice President Mike Pence dropped out of the 2024 presidential race over the weekend, saying it's just not my time. For more, let's welcome in political analyst, best-selling author Mark Halperin. Mark, good morning. Happy Monday. Good to be with you.
And to you. Good to see you.
Why does Mike Pence drop out now? How much of this do you think was just plain and simple about money?
It's a story as old as time itself. It is money. When candidates have money, they almost always go forward. They find a rationale, no matter what the polls say, no matter what the media coverage, no matter what the endorsement situation. When you run out of money, though, you run the risk of embarrassing yourself and your team. And Mike Pence, from the beginning, was challenged for fundraising, and he hit the end of the road.
What's next for Mike Pence? Does he reemerge and run again in 4 years?
Hard to know what he might run for because it's hard to know what the Republican Party post-Donald Trump looks like. If it's still a Trump party in 4 years, I think he might look at the terrain and say he's not the right kind of Republican to do well. But he's a relatively young man, and he certainly has that burning fire to be president. And I've learned over the course of my career for folks in both parties, once they decide they want to be president, that flame never really extinguishes until there are no options left.
Yeah, I think Joe Biden's a great example of that. Do other candidates, Chris Christie comes to mind, Tim Scott comes to mind, ultimately come to this same conclusion in the not so distant future that this might not be my time right now and then run again in 2028?
They might. They both have some sort of money problems, but not as dire as Mike Pence. And as I said before, candidates tend to move around buckets of money, super PAC, campaign, et cetera, as much as possible to stay in. And both of them are running relatively lean campaign operations. So I haven't heard wind of either of them thinking about getting out now. And of course, with no one currently threatening Donald Trump, a new poll out from Iowa today showed he's got a commanding lead. It's tempting if you're at 5% to say, well, the guy and gal at second place are only 10 points ahead of me. Why don't I stick around the hoop and see maybe there's still a chance? And that's, of course, worked to the benefit of Donald Trump in 2016. And is working for his benefit right now.
Yeah, and I think about the candidates that stayed out of the race this time around, Mike Pompeo, Tom Cotton. You think about Rick Scott, Senator from Florida, Josh Hawley, names that I think we could see reemerge in 2028. And I'll add to that, if Trump's the nominee, we'll see people like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley throw their hats back in the ring as well. So I'm wondering if this is the end of Mike Pence's political career, or if he just says, all right, maybe this wasn't the time right now. He's not going to endorse Donald Trump, even though Trump asked for his endorsements, but maybe he comes back in 4 years.
Well, I'm curious to see what he does if Trump becomes the de facto nominee. In other words, he may not endorse him anytime soon. But if Trump wins Iowa and New Hampshire and pretty much everybody starts endorsing him, wouldn't be surprised to see Mike Pence, who's a loyal Republican, get on that bandwagon, although he might make a different choice. I think he's going to have to evaluate whether there's room and also how he wants to spend his time, right? He's not in public office. So if he wants to keep the presidential fires burning, continue to meet with donors, meet with activists, meet with elected officials, he's going to have to structure his life pretty seriously in a way that allows him to do that. Unlike some of the other folks you mentioned who are in elective office, they can do that as natural course of business and charge the taxpayers for it.
All right. Mark, Dean Phillips, third term, he's a three-term Minnesota congressman. So he launches this long shot bid on Friday. He's primarying Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination. What does this mean for Joe Biden, particularly when Phillips wins the New Hampshire primary?
Well, I'm not sure he will. Joe Biden doesn't plan to be on the ballot. He won't be on the ballot, but he does plan to have his folks up there do a write-in effort for him. This is where you get down to something that a lot of voters I've talked to over the years don't quite get why. But this is going to be up to the media. I doubt Phillips will beat Biden, but even if he does, it doesn't mean he's on a path to being the nominee. There won't be any delegates at stake, most likely in New Hampshire, because they're defying the Democratic National Committee. So what will count as a quote-unquote win for Phillips will depend on what you and others in the media decide, and that's something that I'm going to be closely watching as we get closer. Whether Biden wins by a little, wins by a lot, loses, that's going to be up to the press to decide what the quote-unquote meaning of that is for the health of Biden's candidacy.
I think I don't think he's off to a great start because he says he's running against the DNC and not Joe Biden. Take a listen.
If the question is, does this reflect weakness on the part of the president, then the answer, I think, is yes, it does. That you would not see a promising up-and-coming third-term member of Congress filing in this kind of steeply uphill campaign if the president was.
So if he's not running against Joe Biden, who's he running against? If he's not open and honest about that right out of the gate, what does that say about the rest of his campaign?
Well, I think as your question suggested, I think he's got to get his messaging down a little bit more clearly. What is it he's saying about Joe Biden? He mostly seems to be saying Joe Biden's too old and Joe Biden could lose to Donald Trump. In fact, sometimes he leans into that pretty hard. And I think that's going to be the question. Can he tap into the concern folks have of Joe Biden, whether he can beat Donald Trump,
right,
and then whether he can serve 4 more years? And of course, hovering around that is, if he can't serve 4 more years, but he gets reelected, how do people feel about President Kamala Harris?
Mark, what did you make about SNL leading off the show, going after Joe Biden, making fun of Joe Biden?
You and I have talked about this before. If it were a Republican president, I suspect that character would be every cold open,
right,
almost every week. And to be clear, though, Saturday Night Live, more than any other late night show or comedic iconic space, they have hit that theme of Biden's age and Biden being out of it a lot of times with different people playing Biden.
This was different,
one that
though.
Jim Carrey did.
This was different.
No, go look at the one Jim Carrey did. It was actually more mocking than this one.
Well, that's because Jim Carrey's, he's the ultimate overactor.
He's a genius. He's a genius. But all I'm saying is, someone happened to send me the Jim Carrey one over the weekend, and I watched it again, and I forget when it was from, but it was striking how stinging it was on exactly these issues of is Biden too old to do the job? And again, if Democrats think he can win, they will weekend and Bernie him right back into 4 more years, no doubt.
You know what, though,
but
Mark?
What Phillips
I know
is trying to tap into is
Mark,
that
as you know, I'm a student of comedy. Okay, in the Jim Carrey one, yeah, I thought it was funny, but Jim Carrey kind of made Biden look like this, hey, at that time, cool 78-year-old, former senator, former VP, Barack Obama's best buddy with the sunglasses. This guy made Joe Biden look senile. And that's a big departure from the way they've covered Joe Biden in the halls on SNL for the last 3 years, I think. And I think it's the start of maybe we see more of this.